is up, theology nerds? This is Trip, and you're listening to Homebrewed Christianity. That's right. And today on the podcast, you get to hear from not one, but two of my Edinburgh colleagues here at the University of Edinburgh, friends of mine. And this is return visit from Sarah Lane Ritchie, and first-time visit from Joshua Ralston. Many of you will know Sarah. She's been on the podcast, was on the most popular episode of last year. And we're joined by our friend Joshua Ralston. He is a Reformed theologian. He's one of the pioneers in Muslim-Christian dialogue. And, you get to hang out with him in all the ways you get to hang out with staff members in a complete lockdown, which is over Zoom. Anyway, I hope you have a fun time listening to this. Before we hop in, I just want to tell you that Joshua, as part of his work in Muslim-Christian relations, they just launched a MOOC, this open online course that is completely free. You get to learn about Muslim-Christian relations and history, context, and all that kind of stuff. There is a link to it on the page for this post, or you can just go to muslimchristianrelations.net. muslimchristianrelations.net. I set up a redirect there to send you to the page. Also, for those of you that are listening and you're saying to yourself, Trip, I've been asked this question, Trip, when are you going to do an entire Homebrewed Christianity reading group on a theological critique of our economic predicament? When are you going to talk about religion and economic justice? Well, it's right on the horizon. That's right. The next Homebrewed Christianity reading group is with Jörg Rieger. That's right. The man behind Jesus versus Caesar, the author of No Rising Tide, one of the preeminent scholars of economic justice and religion, is joining me for a group called Capital Change. That's right. And you can sign up for this open online reading group, which is donation-based, between $0 and $1 million. Either one. You can just go to mammonorgod.com. mammonorgod.com. You can sign up. You'll join the reading group, get all this type of info and excitement. And it's not just us spending 6 sessions diving deep into a theological critique of our current economic situation. We're also partnering with some friends to provide you with 3 different webinars, the first of which includes some really exciting guests, Cornel West and Angela Koser. So they'll be joining Jörg for a webinar on March 8th, and you can join. So head over to mammonorgod.com, sign up, get ready for the fun. Now, here we go. This episode, Sarah Lane Ritchie, Joshua Ralston, answering a whole bunch of questions you sent in, along with upvoted questions in the religion section on Reddit. I hope you enjoy this. Well, hello, everybody. This is Trip, and today I have 2 of my friends that are smarter than me, all on here to answer questions that you all sent in and or have been upvoted a lot on Reddit, because I said to myself, these are high-quality questions of the people, and that's why you need high-quality scholars of religion to answer them, because this is what people need to know. And so we're going to go back and forth from really high quality questions podcast listeners send in to significantly upvoted religious questions on Reddit. But first, Sarah's been on the podcast quite a bit, but this is Joshua's first time. So Sarah, why don't you tell us about Joshua, what people should know before we start asking questions?
Well, there's the official bio, which I could not tell you a thing from. And then there's what I think of when I think of Joshua Ralston. Oh gosh. So what I do know is that he does Christian Muslim relations and lots of philosophical theology. And he's very good at it. And he brings in lots of great grants. This is what I know about Joshua. But what you really need to know is that he is very snarky. And he kind of looks like he hates you, but he really doesn't. Usually. Sometimes he does, but usually he doesn't. That's all.
Yeah, thanks for that really kind introduction. It's not my fault that my mother passed on the RBF face, and that I also complain with my eyes a lot. So I regret being a speaker in front of me, because even if I like your paper, it looks like I hate it. My youngest daughter has the same face, and she looks at you like you're the worst human being in the world. So it's a really uplifting and cheery way of living.
And for those that don't know, Joshua's here at the University of Edinburgh, where Sarah and I are. He also does a lot of work in Reformed theology. I believe he's running for president of Schleiermacher's fan club next year. Which
Yeah, I got that
I
memo.
say that because if you are looking for doing graduate school, not only is Joshua excellent to work with on Muslim Christian dialogue, but he's recruiting people into the Schleiermacher. You know, if you want to get your FOAD out and discuss things. FOAD is feeling of absolute dependence, if you don't know that. But I just like saying getting your FOAD out, because only theological nerds really know what's happening when you share your FOAD.
Yeah, and it's easier to pronounce than the German, so there we go.
It is. And cool acronyms. Okay, so first question, and this is one I'm very interested in what you think. Josh, and you could definitely mention the MOOC you just launched. But one of the questions was, what are the 3 most annoying things that come out of Christians' mouths consistently about Islam? So you do a lot in Christian Muslim dialogue. So even if you don't really understand your religious neighbor as a Christian, if we just stopped saying these 3 things and told people to shush on it, things would go in a better direction.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm a theologian who engages with Islamic thought and with Muslims, and so I hear a lot of these kind of comments, throwaway ones, whether that's just from a regular lay person, but even many from well-known and published theologians. So I think if I would have to say 3 things that I always hear that really get under my skin, one is, why is Islam's view of God so focused on law and anger, and so violent, which is kind of a recurring theme that Christians should maybe think a little bit differently about, in part because Islam, the 2 most common names of God after Allah are Al-Rahman and Al-Rahim, which means the merciful one and the compassionate one, which is, if you're into 80s rock, the Bismillah, or watch Wayne's World for that old school reference, which means in the name of God, the merciful and the compassionate. So that's one thing. The other, of course, being like, why are Muslims so violent, which you hear all the time. I'll tell a longer story. When I worked at Union Presbyterian Seminary for 3 years as an assistant professor of theology there, which is a PCUSA seminary in Richmond, Virginia, I was also like a theologian in residence at a local PCUSA church. And we were doing like a adult education class, and they wanted to know more about Islam. And so I was doing some lectures, and one of the persons asked, this was in the height of ISIS, and if you remember, ISIS burned a Jordanian pilot in a cage. And so they asked me, why is it that Muslims are so violent in their religion and don't treat others as full equals? And here I am in Richmond, Virginia, capital of the Confederacy, second largest slave port in the United States after New Orleans. And I'm also in a Reformed church where there's pictures in the back of John Calvin. And I just mentioned, these are horrible acts, but we also use them as ways to forget our own history. John Calvin famously was involved in burning Servetus at the stake, although that story is much longer. And of course, the U.S. Constitution has written into it that Africans and African Americans and people who are black are only worth 3/5 of humanity. So I often think some of our comments about Islam are as much ways of avoiding our own history. So why is Islam so violent? One thing. Why is the God so law focused are the other ones. And then obviously there's always questions about women and gender, and those are really complicated. And I think they're worth pursuing, but in the same way that we can talk about the ways in which critiques of Islam our ways of evading critiques of our own tradition. I think that's something that we should still talk about, but maybe not say so quickly. Yeah, those would be the three that come to mind and I get most regularly. One of my old teachers who used to teach at the University of Edinburgh, David Kerr, said whenever he went to whenever he went to churches, the first thing that everyone would ask is, why are Muslims so violent and why do they treat their women so poorly? And the first thing that he heard whenever he went to mosques were, why are Christians so violent and why do they sexualize and use their women as sexual objects? So it's interesting the ways in which we often parallel one another.
So you just launched the MOOC. So say something about that because you put a lot of effort into it. And people that probably haven't experienced you in your mustard yellow shirt, your sweater, which is just on point, all there in the MOOC.
Yeah, I should have worn it today, or at least my off pink one to brighten up the life. Yeah. I was told after the first recording, where I wore like a white shirt and a navy jacket or something, that I looked too dark and I wasn't popping on camera, and they implied that my face also didn't look inviting enough. So if your face can't be inviting, make your shirt look inviting. So, wear some pinks and some mustards. Anyway, we've got a new MOOC. It's on FutureLearn, run by the Christian Muslim Studies Network here at Edinburgh. And it's put together by my colleague, Dr. Shada Rahmatullah, and myself, also featuring Professor Mona Siddiqui and other scholars across the world, Gabriel Seid Reynolds at Notre Dame. We have a podcast with him and other people, and it's free online course, 4 weeks. Go at your own pace. We look at the Bible and the Quran, especially the story of Abraham, Jesus and Muhammad, case studies of Constantinople and southern Spain, and then a look at modern Egypt. And so it's free. You can sign up, pre-recorded videos, podcasts, ways of engaging, but there's also a discussion board, and all of us are actually quite engaged at the moment since it's our first go-around. So you can find all the information about that and still catch up for the next few weeks. And yeah, you can see me in a mustard suit talking at a camera, or even better, in a maroon or burgundy jacket interviewing Mona Siddiqui. That one's better.
Awesome. And I'll put the links to it on the post for this if people are looking for it. All right. So here's y'all's first question from the wonderful world of Reddit board. Here's a good one. So my neighbor's totally doing this thing called Lent, so he's not eating chocolate or drinking. That sounds horrible. Christians already get rid of sex before marriage. Now they're getting rid of chocolate and drinking in lockdown. WTF? Is Lent really Christian?
You got to lead us off, Sarah, because
I grew up Southern Baptist, and now I'm like marginally Christian. So I am not the resource to talk to on Lent.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not, I'm Protestant, and I have practiced Lent before. In part, I lived in the Middle East for a while and attended Anglican churches, Lutheran churches, and the PCUSA has had a little bit more of a liturgical renewal than here in Scotland, where the Church of Scotland, because of long-standing rivalries with the Catholic Church and the Anglican Church, tends to not practice Lent, which would be the traditional Reformed way of doing things. Is it really Christian? I mean, yes and no. What do we mean by that, right? The dominant forms of Christianity, Orthodox, Catholic, Episcopalian, Lutheran, yeah, of course, it's part of the liturgical year. It's part of a preparation for entering into this. One of the things that I found really interesting and different about the experience of Lent in comparison to the experience of Ramadan, as well as Lent in Eastern Orthodox traditions, is the communal nature of it versus the ways in which a lot of Western Christians, it's kind of arbitrary, like I'm going to give up Netflix or I'm going to give up ice cream or whatever, while in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, there's much more of a sense of moving towards it and prescribe things, and you can eat less and less, right? And more specific things, which I actually think is a much more helpful way of thinking about it, because then it's a communal formation. Same with Ramadan, where you have this period of fasting and then celebrating. I can't imagine trying to celebrate Ramadan by myself. Well, I'm not a Muslim, so I don't celebrate it. But the ways in which it's also a communal activity. And right now, I mean, we've done Lent before, but Lent right now, all of the last year is Lent. So I don't need extra things to help me prepare for suffering of Christ.
Yeah, I think that one of the things, if you kind of hear about Lent and don't know about it, is to recognize that across religious traditions, fasting shows up in all sorts of different ways. And when Lent gets turned into, just don't drink or eat chocolate, then you're missing the fact that, this is one of the kind of spiritual technologies of religious traditions. And then Jesus, when he talks about fasting, says like when you fast, right? In the Sermon on the Mount, the assumption is you're going to at some point. That type of practice is part of spiritual formation, but you see it in multiple religious traditions.
Yeah, and there's a real strong case to be made for something like Lent. The sort of a lot of the Protestant traditions that are not very liturgically grounded, and kind of try and get away with as much tradition really as possible, they really lose out on the embodied value that can come from practicing Lent, or things like Lent. It doesn't have to be like one month out of the year. It can be incorporating a posture towards the divine and your community that puts you into a space, a certain sort of space, and makes you more receptive to God. It might make you feel the need for God in a way that you don't usually experience. And there are a variety of ways that you can get yourself into that space. But the church traditionally has just found that something like Lent, a formalized, communal kind of sanctioned period of the liturgical year, is a valuable way to do it.
Yeah, and I think the community aspect that Josh said is a really good one. And there are alternative ways of doing it, right? Like if your faith community doesn't do it, you can do it with a small group of people and stuff like that. When I was a minister, I facilitated all sorts of different groups that did different types of fasts and stuff. The hardest was a fast from screens, and it was harder than not drinking. And really bad for my Twitter following. But so one of the other questions that someone sent in, let's see, Angela said, how does your own personal doubts, struggles, beliefs impact the things that you focus on as scholars of religion, and how are they related, to each other and impact your own passion for research and stuff? Because unlike certain fields, she said she does medieval history, like she likes medieval history and is working on her master's, but it's not like all of a sudden medieval history has this deep impact for how you understand yourself in the world in the same way looking at, more directly religious topics does.
Yeah. Well, I'm certainly one whose entire career has been 100% autobiography. Everything I've done in the scholarly world has been like a direct result of my own questing and seeking and asking of various questions. So, I work in science and religion. People have heard me before, they know this. I work in science and religion. And in particular, I focus on the intersection of theology, philosophy of mind, and the various brain-related sciences. And there are two directions to my own research. So one is the top-down question. So if God exists and God does stuff in the world, and particularly does stuff within the human mind, what does that mean? What is happening? What is happening there? If we pray and we ask God to reveal God's self to us in one way or another, or we sense God's presence, or we sense that God has spoken to us in some way, what are we saying about how God is interacting with the physical world? And so that was kind of my first book was all about that divine action in the human mind. Like if God exists and does stuff, what is that saying? And, but that whole project, that whole book basically came out of me being a 9-year-old kid reading a novel in my bed at night. and not being sure if God existed. And so what I did is I looked at the last word on the last page of that book. And I closed the book and I said, okay, God, if you exist, then change the last word of this last page of this book, and I will know that you're there. And of course, God did not change that last word or that last page of that book, but variations on that kind of question from me had continued to evolve and show up throughout my life. But then the other direction of my own research is the bottom up direction. So this is like the belief formation part of things. So I'm like really fascinated by how and why people come to believe the things that they believe. And in particular, the question of like, well, do we have any agency in this? Do we choose to believe something, or is it just something that happens within us, or it doesn't? And so, like my own personal kind of quest for a felt sense of God has driven a lot of my own research questions about like cognitive science of religion, evolutionary psychology, the neurobiology of religious experience, and looking at various ways that people can put themselves indirectly into situations where they are more likely to end up with a felt sense of God's reality and action.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting as theologians or scholars of religion, the way that our history, our interests influence our own lived reality. There's a bunch of ways you could talk about it. I mean, I think as someone who identifies as a theologian, also the sense that how does my own material reality and the fact that I need a job, like, impact what I'm writing and what I'm thinking? Like, can I be as honest as I am? Like, have I given myself so much to this career that I'm sort of invested in the perpetuation of the field, even if I'm not totally into it? That's one thing that I think always weighs on me. Like, do I really believe this? Do I think that this is something that makes sense of intellectual tradition, scriptural tradition, the realities of our world? Or am I just saying this because I'm playing the game? And I do find that also often present. But more specifically to my own like academic interests, there's no way that I can think about it without it intertwining with my life. I've told this story, well, not here, but elsewhere. I was not planning on doing a project that was a comparative work on Christian-Muslim relations. I always had interest in Islam and Islamic studies, but I was your very typical sort of Protestant theologian, interested in your kind of typical German dead guys with some philosophy on the side. I'd done philosophy undergrad. I'd always been interested in German theology, and that was what I was planning on doing. But at the same time, I was doing my PhD in Atlanta, where I'd also done my MDiv at Emory. My wife and I were involved in refugee resettlement, and I became really close friends with three guys from Northern Sudan, Egypt, Ibrahim, Amr, and Tamar. And like we would hang out together. They would, I would help them with their English. They would invite me over for iftar, which is the breaking of the Ramadan fast. We'd have them over for like Easter dinner. And we started asking questions, or they started asking questions like, you know, how is it that Christians can believe God is one and yet pray in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit? Why, if God is merciful, does God need Jesus to die for your sins? Couldn't Jesus just forgive you? How can Jesus be both God and human, right? And here I am, a PhD student taking a course on Schleiermacher, Thomas Aquinas, and hermeneutics and history in the philosophy department. So like Kant, Habermas, Dilthey, Heidegger, right? So bigwig theologians, bigwig philosophers, and yet their questions were much more challenging to me than how does Thomas parse Chalcedonian theory? How does Schleiermacher make sense of German Romanticism? Because I was already in the game, right? You already know how to play the game, how you reference, and there was a way in which their questions as 19 to 22-year-old boys got at the heart of what Christian theology is trying to ask. And for me, it was like, oh, wow, if I struggle to answer these in a way that is coherent, is honest to my own faith, but also makes sense to them, not in an apologetic way. I still have an anti-apologetics from my Bardian days in me, but in giving a sensible account. how much more so if I engage with the broader Islamic tradition? And I started to read and take Arabic and live in the Middle East. And in many ways, while there are textual questions, intellectual questions, all of that comes back to my lived reality of how do I make sense of Christian claims in light of the challenges that Muslims raise to me. So there's other ways it might shift from being more Bardian to Schleiermachian, also relates to my own personal narrative as well. So it's deeply intertwined. But I think one of the things is to be self-aware enough about it, and the temptations to not actually be honest with yourself because, you need that next publication.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
How about you, Tripp?
Oh, I mean, I don't worry that much about like whether or not I just say what I'm thinking. I will say that does have effects on your career trajectory. Like, let's say you have a podcast and a lot of people listen to it, and you make consistent sweeping dismissals towards large portions of your peers. But it's not like I don't think that. Certain things aren't interesting to me and aren't compelling, right? So for me, I see myself as a theologian, but like it's connected to my ordination as a minister. Like I see myself as a theologian of the church, and I don't think we do anyone any favors in our tradition if the people that spend the most time wrestling and thinking with things aren't honest about what they're thinking at any point. I also think with most academic religious scholars take themselves too seriously, right? In 1,000 years, they're still going to be reading like the same ancient text of each religious tradition and won't see this video or really know anything the three of us said. So what's wrong with the scholars that are both scholars and members of traditions to be honest and straightforward? The other perk of doing that is you don't have to have two versions of yourself, which if you're ministers, I'm sure know this. I didn't decide not to have two versions of myself. I just already had horrible things on the internet that I said inebriated when I became a minister, because I started a podcast in graduate school before I ever worked on there. It's like, what do you do? Take it off the internet? So, which was a perk, right? As a minister, is that everyone knew they could just Google and find things where I'm clearly a heretic, or when I'm at a UCC church, more Christian than most of the people there. But that was freeing. But I didn't like think about it. It just was always on the internet. Making the movie got me in a lot more trouble than I thought. Like a couple years ago, I made a movie where it's a buddy road trip comedy, and in it, I roll a joint with a page I ripped out of a Bible, and I thought it was funny. That was like a different type of response. And I was shocked because I'm saying to myself, like, what have I ever done that made you think I had a magical relationship with paper that a translation of ancient text was on? But, I didn't think about putting that in and skipping the joke because it would be offensive. I just was like, well, I've said way worse, Yeah, but I would say, like, one of the things that Sarah said, like, I kind of have, adjacent possible versions of myself, right? Where how you engage science and philosophy and traditions, where if I thought this was more plausible or resonated more deeply, then I would no longer be a Christian minister. And I completely understand people that aren't sure about their religious content. So I think you can have more beautiful and integrity-filled accounts of yourself intellectually and as a person, and end up in lots of places.
Yeah. I mean, just to follow up, I do think it's not disingenuous to be attentive to your audience as long as you're also being honest with who you are and who yourself. So like you said, the way I'm going to present something is going to be different if I'm teaching an undergraduate class or I'm giving a seminar, or if I'm talking at a church or I'm talking at a mosque or I'm talking to my neighbors who have no religious tradition. I want to be consistent with what I think is true, but I'm not always consistent in my own self, right? Like, I don't always know what I think. There isn't one Joshua Ralston in some ways. Like, there's multiple versions of how I'm going to argue and how I'm going to think. But in terms of your point, being consistent with the central cores of your commitments intellectually, socially, morally, even if you're aware of the ways in which you might articulate that different in different contexts.
Yeah, I like that. And I think that you see this playing out in different contexts a bit differently. So Phil Clayton and Steve Knapp wrote in their book, I think it's Predicament of Belief. They wrote about how there's like a sort of like a hierarchy of faith, right? And one level on this like hierarchy is a place where you can say, here's where I'm at in terms of my understanding of God. But I can acknowledge that if I had this, and this experience, I would be here. And it's a sort of a generous space, I think, where you can acknowledge that, like, yeah, I might not believe this, or I might not be in a position where I'm experiencing God in this way or at all. But I'm not like militantly like opposed to people who are in this place, because I can acknowledge that if I have experiences that they are saying that they have had, or if I had the sort of inner sense of God or whatever, that they are saying that they have, then yeah, I would be in that place as well. So in the US, you see this playing out with, you can see this playing out with charismatic evangelicals. Let's just take that as an example, because you can listen to someone explain how they had an incredibly transformative and powerful charismatic experience in which they felt like they were, it was a born again experience, and a very dramatic one. And they are obviously existing in a particular context, in a church, in a community that is structuring their beliefs and in the way that they live out their faith. And I can look at them and acknowledge, like, yeah, if I had been in that context and I had those sorts of experiences, I would also be holding to the sorts of theology that they hold. Here in the UK, it's a bit different. In the particular world that Tripp and I are working in at the moment in science and religion, you have a fascinating breed of Thomistic scholars. So like high church Anglicans who are, they're Thomists. And in this context, what that means is that they can affirm the truth of the Christian tradition doctrinally as it has been passed down and is received through the church. And they are very happy to sort of affirm that in its totality and in a very insulated way, so that the core claims of Christianity are inherently immune to scientific critique. So there's like nothing, if you're a good Thomist, there's like nothing, because of the various aspects of the theology involved, there's nothing that science could say that would impact your affirmation of all the core tenets of Christianity. And it's a really interesting, but so I'm not personally a Thomist, but I can affirm that if I had grown up in an extremely liturgical, traditional setting and had experienced the value of that kind of church and had a sense of the rightness of and a trust in the institution and in the tradition and in the way that the corpus of Christian theology had been passed down through the ages, if I had those experiences, I can see how I also would approach the science and religion pursuit and task dialogue in a way that they are. But I haven't had those experiences. So I have to sort of like be honest about where I'm located. And at the same time, I can be generous towards, say, the charismatic evangelical or the high church Anglican, as they orient themselves to truth and theological knowledge production, if you will.
There's some things just don't work for me. And, well, here's one way of putting it. I'm interested in, and maybe how both of you see this is, in our contemporary context, there's no way of, short of kind of militant conservatism, of holding one's religious tradition without in some way internalizing critiques that are just kind of ubiquitous in like the culture that most of us are in. And so then there becomes this kind of, there are different ways you relate to the critiques, right? Some people create a stack of apologetics, right? That goes through all the criticisms in science or philosophy or pluralism or whatever, the different doctrines are problematic, settle them. And so then they can repeat the tradition. And, that's one way. Others internalize the critiques and take a more humble approach, but then try to articulate the fullness of the tradition. I think that's been my experience with high church Anglicans. It's not they don't take any of it seriously. It's just like the way they locate themselves in the tradition. It preserves kind of the large Christian outline of doctrines that in dialogue with those criticisms, right? And so it type a more humbleness. Then there are others who those questions like are internalized in a way you kind of rethink through everything. And you don't really have like finality on certain things. You're more confident over here than over here, but the questions are internalized into the constructive process in a way. Just the idea of performing the totality of the tradition and its richest confession is hard. And if that's the side I'm on, that then it's just hard to hear kind of a fixed account of the tradition. Like if it sounds like what it sounded like in the 16th century, then I'm like, what are we doing? Like, I don't know how to do that. And I couldn't imagine doing it, but yet you're doing it. So how does that, it's like, how do you see that in the Reformed tradition, Josh?
Yeah. That's a complicated question about what do we mean by Reformed. I have a lot more time for Calvin than you do. And that probably a lot of your listeners do. But I probably have as equal amounts, if not even more, frustration with the sort of hardline reading of Calvin, as if he's settled everything or as if the scholastics settled everything. And there is a ways in which what I appreciate about the Reformed tradition, as I often say, like I'm not a hardline Reformed person. I find that where I'm situated, but it's one account of the Christian tradition in a host of others. And I'm a little bit eclectic and liking some other parts as well. But I do think within Reformed theology and the sort of strands that I'm coming through, the things about Calvin and the legacy of Calvin that I appreciate, which you can tell the ways I get to Schleiermacher, is one, an attentiveness to theology within the bounds of piety and the church, right? So it's actually not an apologetic task. It's a reflection on a lived piety, and you can see this with Barth as well. The rejection of apologetics, even if Barth himself later creates a huge edifice, right, that repristinates the whole tradition. So I think that's an important part for me. There's also in Calvin and in some later Reformed thinkers an anti-speculative trend, right? Don't say more than you can about what God is like. Recognize that all language about God is limited and flawed, that even Scripture itself is an accommodation to us. We don't get to hold on to God. And so those are parts of the Reformed tradition that I want to affirm. The need, especially in the PCUSA, this is slightly different than PCA, some Dutch traditions, the Church of Scotland even, the recognition that confessions are multiple and need to respond to the context in which they're found. I really appreciate the PCUSA having a book of confessions and recognizing that we have a multiplicity of how we're going to articulate this. And, in terms of what you were saying before, I would locate myself somewhere between the radical, where you would locate yourself, and the Thomists, as you called them, because I don't think, take Schleiermacher, he does go through the whole tradition again in the Glaubenslehre. And same with Barth, and he's much more revisionist than people realize. But they're doing so somewhere in between those two. So I do want to rethink the whole tradition. So what does it mean for me to say that God is truly present in Jesus? I can't say it in the same way that Chalcedon says it, because those ontologies and metaphysics are not available to me. What does it mean to say Jesus has died for the sake of the world? And that means revising Calvin, Anselm, other people, and being open to critique. A central part of my own theological disposition even if people don't think I'm this way as a person, is to try to like nurture a lot of theological humility. So we need to say something, but we say something aware of the fact that it's human all the way down, right? Theology is talk about God, but it isn't God in God's self. So I do think I need, I still affirm something like original sin, but my account of it is so vastly different than Augustine's or Calvin's, right? It's much more existential. It's much more a sense of our stuckness. Does that make me, I mean, I don't want to just, here's the tradition, because I think there's huge problems with it. But I also want to be aware that I'm operating within it, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. And honestly, the depravity is the coolest point of Calvinism, right? Like if you had to pick one point, that's easily the one most humans that are honest resonate with. And the other thing about just, this is something that stuck out to me, in just being in the Scottish Reform context, that's not the American Reform context. Because in America, the dominant form of Calvinism and culture is like the neo-Calvinist one that like can't distinguish church dogmatics from toxic masculinity. And here, like ones that would agree in many theological ways are like conservative, reformed Scottish people are also socialists, which doesn't happen in America. They tend to be libertarian. So that's my theory is if you are more conservative reform person, it's better to be in Scotland, because then you don't like have Ayn Rand next to the institutes.
Yeah. I mean, it's, I don't even think it's just the neo-Calvinists. It's like the new hardline Calvinists, right? The scholasticism meets Driscoll kind of thing. And I appreciate that you gave a shout out to some more conservative reformed. As you know, Kathy Tanner's a big influence on my own work. Mm-hmm. And one of the things she does in the Politics of God, right, is to say, here's this doctrine of double predestination. It can lead to really horrible politics, and it can lead to really cool politics too. There's no direct line between having the right theology and having good politics. It's how you analyze and how you engage them. That isn't to say that theology doesn't have repercussions, but the repercussions of any one theological doctrine largely depend on how and where they're manifested. I mean, I've written on this, other people have written on this. It's a huge difference to talk, Michelle Sanchez, for instance, it's a huge difference to talk about you're an elect person of God if you're a persecuted minority scattered throughout Europe outside of the center of power, right, which is what Calvin was, and to say you're an elect person of God and you're the slave owner or the leader of apartheid. Right? Your social position of hearing that proclaimed on you is really different. It needs to be attended to, and attending more to what the function of Calvin's own experiences as a migrant were in that his strong development of providence, I think, opens up ways of reading him that aren't so God's the biggest jerk in the world that's decreeing snowstorms to kill people in Texas and whatnot.
Tanner's critique of people developing political theologies from their doctrine of the Trinity, she makes something similar about the Trinity as well as the double predestination thing, and I find that really helpful. You have to say one of the funniest responses I got to at this participating in the Trinity conference thing. When I was in graduate school, I did a paper on it where I was responding to someone who did the whole, social Trinity sets up for, whatever egalitarian social democracy or whatnot. And I responded to it and said processy things. And one of my friends who's like very conservative Catholic, he just said, well, we all know if Tripp had given the first paper, he would have said that as metaphysics turns the world into a giant hippie drum circle. And I was like, that's literally the funniest takedown of process thought ever. And it might actually be true. It's just, I love hippie drum circles, especially when it's on the beach and next to a taco stand. So,
I'll take the beach and the tacos, but no drum circle. I'm still curmudgeony.
Yeah, that's how you know you're really reformed. If you're at a beach and there are tacos and you're like, I'm not joining the drum circle. It also depends on like what your chemical makeup is prior to said drum circle beginning. And yeah. So one of the questions that came in that I thought, oh, this is really good, and y'all could get at it from your own areas of research in really different ways. Well, there are two questions, both on religious experience. And so maybe the easiest way is, how do you understand the role of experience when thinking about religion, spirituality, and such? And because Sarah spends a lot of time looking at it through the psychological sciences, brain sciences, and such. And then I know the role of experience in Schleiermacher has a particular place, but also in the Reformed tradition in the 19th century, it shows back up. What role it plays in thinking constructively as a scholar of religion in your different fields would be fascinating to compare and contrast how it shows up.
This is a softball for me. I mean, like, how long do I have? I could go on about experience and the role of religious experience and whatever for ages. But let me not do my usual shtick here. People really do like to downplay the importance of colloquial understandings of religious experience. So if you talk to, like, I would say like 95% of the theologians out there, or even like 95% of like Christians out there, almost all of them are going to say you should never focus on religious experience. So you'll get a variety of takes on this. So you'll have theologians saying, well, yes, but like our faith is based in tradition and scripture and religious practice and devotion and discipleship and all of these things. And you'll have even like evangelical Christians, for example, will say, yeah, it might be great when we have like an amazing religious experience, but we should never seek them, and we should never count on them as being in any way definitive for our faith. But this is sort of a red herring. Like when you caricature religious experience as being this thing that happens when you meditate and sit in a cave for 3 weeks or something like that. It's you're really missing what we're talking about when we talk about experience. So I think probably one of the great fallacies in theological thinking is that our theology comes from nowhere. All theology comes from somewhere. And there's a really strong case to be made, I think, that even the most abstract and propositional arguments made in theology and that we have received in tradition are of course being codified and solidified in the context of human experience, communal experience, individual experience. So the role of experience is, I think, like, we just have to take it for granted. It is extremely important. Megan Page, a philosopher of science at Loyola, Maryland, I believe, she talks about science as being basically just a systematized, organized analysis of experience. So, I mean, we think of science today as being something that occurs in a chemistry lab in a basement somewhere, but empirical inquiry is essentially just experience that we are trying to understand and collectively look at, so that we're not subjectively retreating subjectively into our own experience alone. So there's a really strong argument to be made that science is really just like a helpful way of discussing and analyzing and arguing about which experiences should be what our experiences of the world are telling us, and it's really difficult to separate the role of experience from theology. In fact, I think even the people who think that they are doing this are probably not, if you look deep enough or if you go back far enough. So all that to say that experience is always, we are always incorporating experience into our theology in one way or another. And my own work, I'm particularly interested in immersive experiences, and I'm very unashamed about this. So most people do not want to talk or think about theologically, at least they don't want to have to grapple with the role of immersive, intense experiences. But there's a lot of great science out there that suggests that when you have immersive experiences of one form or another, they do change you. They change the way that you perceive the world. And that is not only psychologically and scientifically interesting, but should be theologically interesting. And there's a strong case to be made that I won't make here because I've made it elsewhere, but like there's a strong case to be made that the church at its best, it provides immersive experiences for people to better encounter God and deepen relationships with each other.
So if it's a softball for Sarah, it's a fastball at my face for me. I don't like to talk about experience, just like I don't like drum circles. That said, I do think Sarah raises a whole bunch of really important points about being honest about our situatedness, our own context. I've already talked about how it was an experience that was combined with an intellectual question, right? So those aren't separated. That had me engage with Islam. It was living in Egypt and in Ramallah that further influenced that. So what was experience and what was intellectual reason and tradition? Those were all intertwined with one another. The experience of living where Jesus lived, right? It's a totally different thing to go on a 1-week Christian pilgrimage thing and say, oh my gosh, I walk where Jesus walked, and I had this experience of going into those places. You can have that be an immersive experience, but living there for 2 years, going through checkpoints, seeing the ways in which God is invoked to reinforce political injustice, the normality of it, it actually does the opposite, right? It's like, oh wait, this is just a normal, regular place with all the same shit that is everywhere else. And so I have to be honest about the ways in which that has shaped me. I do think one of the biggest problems in the way theological education, at least in the States, but also think in the UK has had is its sort of tarred Schleiermacher with he's all about experience. It's all about subjectivity in the individual. There's no tradition. There's no reason. And what that does is just collapse culture into Christianity, and it leads to Hitler or something like this, which is just a storyline that Barth and some other of the dialectic theologians levied against him. Now, with Barth, and I think also with Schleiermacher, I am worried about the ways in which what I just described can happen. You can see it in U.S. culture right now, the use of God to just justify one's own politics, culture, and opinion. But I think Schleiermacher has an account of the place of experience in theology that, as Sarah was saying, is both recognized of the person's individual piety, their sense of mystery in the world, the whatness, but also that's brought into critical conversation with a community, right? For Schleiermacher, it's not the piety of an individual, it's the piety of a community that's formed in history, and that there's an important place in that for orthodoxy and heterodoxy, for challenge, but it's a much more dynamic conversation. I think there's a tendency, especially, no offense to the Methodists, I mean, I went to a Methodist seminary and did a PhD at a Methodist institution, but there's a way in which that fourfold quadrangle makes it sound like what experience is individual personal piety. My heart is strangely warmed. My experience with God, which is part of it. But I think what Sarah's referencing in terms of science, what Schleiermacher, the revival of Schleiermacher amongst a lot of us former Barthians is trying to say is, look, no, experiences is that, but it's also that in dialogical and communal conversations, and where my experience begins and the communities begins are really porous boundaries, and to think much more intentionally about what that means for theology, not as a ground and a norm, but as a given function of it. And I mean, my own, I was way more Barthian when I was in seminary and PhD program than I am now, but I remember Luke Timothy Johnson, who was my New Testament professor, always talking about that, like, look, Christianity is an experience of the presence of Jesus as saving, right? And everything gets reinvigorated in light of that. And so, or his own books and works on LGBTQ belonging in the church, the experience of the Spirit pouring out on people and the ways in which that critically evaluates the tradition. I think those are much more dynamic ways of thinking about the place of experience than some of the individualism that can come about in America, or the misreadings of the dialectic theologians of Barth of Schleiermacher.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's really helpful. So I wonder what y'all think about this. This is something I've been stewing on related to this. Is that for most of church history, the individuals were in a culture that was so much part of Christendom that their experience of the world, it was like everyone lived inside of a church, and the stained glass windows were always mediating the radiance of the sun. Right. So when you're encountering the world, the big story of Scripture, of where you came from, where you're going, right, dealing with death and origins, are all tied into this big cathedral where meaning, purpose, value, and stuff is teeming because the light of the sun is all filtered in this place. Everyone has a shared narrative, rituals, all these types of things. And those immersive experiences happen in part because those big life transitions, those deep griefs and extreme joys, there's a shared meta-narrative, framing device, mythopoetic narrative, all these things, rituals and stuff to work out being human in. And one of the things we're stuck at today is not only are there a multiplicity, right, of cathedrals in a sense of different religious traditions, but everyone can go on the outside of theirs and realize that the stained glass windows on the other side look like a kid took crayons, chewed it up, and vomited it out. And it makes no sense, right? And you could get these critical reflections on the religious tradition. And yet one of the things that I think Sarah's emphasizing is how those deep immersive experiences are an important part of being human, right? And so as theologians, I feel like I have this weird task of really cherishing and valuing the experiences I have, and invested in cultivating more beautiful, life-giving, justice-inspiring ones in the tradition I grew up in. And as a philosopher of religion, I also know what it's like to sit on the outside and go, yeah, but that's just insert whatever your critical reflection is. Or as a theologian, you thought this was real important. Yeah, but that's a kind of idolatry, right? I don't really know what to do with that other than it's a real task. And I can imagine asking the same question within the cathedral of my tradition and asking it out. And I won't say the same thing, but I am the same person. But if the experience part is important, then there are things we cut ourselves off from if our critical, I don't know, if our critical inquiry ends up deflating all the cultural narratives that allow and evoke for these intense religious experiences, and just basic conversations where you have a shared narrative and framework.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really interesting analogy, the cathedral, right? You know, there's some parallels to Plato and the cave analogy, right? But I also think one of the things that I spend a lot of time on, I mean, I've talked a lot about Calvin, Schleiermacher, and Barth, but I also read a lot in terms of Islamic theology as well as Arabic-speaking Christian theologians, especially from the medieval and early Islamic period, right? And their world's a really different one. They're living in, as Sidney Griffith says in a really good book, under the shadow of the mosque. And so the world, they still have their cathedral, you know, they still have their cathedrals and their monasteries, and they still are operating. But now all of a sudden, there's this massive minaret or a call to prayer that infuses their reality, and the ways in which both shared discourses were possible then through philosophical language, mathematics, physics, art, the Arabic language itself, debates about God, but also the ways in which that gets refracted. And, you know, obviously, when you leave Western Europe, and even if you go back, you know, 7th century and before, the world of Christian theology wasn't always that cathedral, and there's plenty of places where it wasn't. Ethiopia, Middle East, Arabic world, India. And I think I'm finding those places really interesting ways to learn from. What does it mean to think theologically in conversation. I mean, I also work in comparative theology in this way and realize that we're not doing something new. It's been done from a long time. But as you said, there is this challenge of saying, what happens if you're honest my PhD supervisor was very much in the post-liberal school, so second naivete. Yes, we know all of these critical things, but we also need this community. We need this discourse. And there's parts of that I really appreciate, but there's also parts of it where it just feels like, yeah, it's not a second naivete. It's still a first one sometimes, especially for people that didn't come through it. And so one of the real challenges I think that you're rightly putting on is we do need these ritual markers. We do need to have ways of recognizing our shared humanity, the longer tradition, the mystery. My own attraction to Islamic practices are in part because of that. But and why there are so many people converting to Roman Catholicism or Eastern Orthodoxy from evangelicalism, or even some mainliners, it gives you some of that sense. But for those of us that can't go there for various reasons, like, what do we have as shared experiences, especially if part of the mainline where I've located myself is in decline and is still living off sort of a nostalgia for the 1950s. What does that mean for the kind of things you're asking? I think is really important. I don't have an answer. If you had one, then I would probably have more stability in this world.
Well, one small perk of Donald Trump is that there's now as many white mainline Protestants as there are white evangelicals in America. That's just crazy. Like, he was good at something. What is it like going through lockdown in a presidential election as Americans in Scotland, considering all the different things that have happened, and you think about the politics, the role of religion, and all these types of things? What kind of observations come to mind, kind of looking from the outside, both about pandemic, presidential election, all that kind of stuff?
Maybe Sarah can go. I mean, one of the things that's interesting about both Sarah and I don't want to speak for her, is that both of us have spent considerable portions of our lives, either our childhoods or our adult lives, outside of the United States. For me, that wasn't until I was an adult. I mean, but the majority of my adult life has been spent in Scotland, in Egypt, in the West Bank, in Palestine. So I've gone through many cycles of American elections, very big American events. I mean, I was in an Arabic tutorial at Al-Azhar, the Sunni head of learning, when I found out bin Laden had been killed, and the experience of that there versus in the US, totally different. So there's a whole host of ways that maybe my own experience in the last year I'm more used to it than if you hadn't been apart. There's certain ways that it's different, right? Where you're looking, especially at the Trump thing, mediated through news. And one of the nice things is American news is omnipresent everywhere, but it's not as omnipresent as is in the United States. So you could get away with it. We had Brexit to deal with, Boris Johnson, various other things going on in the EU, UK, Scottish independence thing. So it wasn't Trump 24/7, and you could turn it off in a way that I didn't feel like my friends in the States could turn off, right? I didn't need to go on choose your newspaper channel, newspaper or your channel. I could watch something else. America is still present, but it's not the only thing, and it gives you some healthy sense to realize, as crazy as things are in the United States, they're actually crazy a lot of other places as well. So
that's really interesting. I had almost the exact opposite experience, and I think it's my own fault, to be honest. People will often say, "Oh, aren't you glad that you're not in the US? You don't have to deal with the madness, the craziness." And I'm like, actually, because of a lot of my friends and all of my family are in the US, and I'm very plugged in various social media outlets, and I can't help but stay clued in to what's going on. I can't help it. I obsess as much as anybody else in the US about the details of the last 4 years. And I feel like I may as well have been there. because of that's the level of engagement I had with it. And it wasn't good for me. It wasn't good for me, but I also felt like I couldn't turn away. And it wasn't just it's not just that I'm a glutton for punishment here. It is also that I don't think I'm doing anyone any favors by ignoring things that are actually happening. So, and Josh, I'm not saying that you were ignoring things that were actually happening, but even to the point of, I routinely will scroll through the Facebook feed of of a church in my hometown that I've been particularly connected with in the past. Basically just like doom scrolling through their Facebook page, just like in horror at the things that they were saying about Donald Trump and, all the prophecies about Donald Trump being reelected and everything. And just all of it. And then of course being here, during a pandemic as well, it's only intensified everything. So I also, like Joshua, have spent a big part of my life overseas. So in my high school years, I was in Bangladesh and Pakistan, and then I've been here for 7.5 years. So I have spent a good chunk of my life overseas, and I've been outside of the American exceptionalism mindset for a very long time. And very little surprises me anymore about America. I'm not optimistic about the future of America. And I certainly am not anywhere close to a Christian nationalist or an exceptionalist when it comes to the role of America in the world. And most of the time, I'm just pretty much embarrassed to be in America. There are times in different situations where I literally will not speak. I will not open my mouth to say something because I don't want everyone around me, wherever I'm at, like a coffee shop or a store or whatever, because I don't want everyone around me to realize I'm an American. I do often get embarrassed to be an American. But for me, I will say, this past year has been different, I think, than most, because I was also pregnant and having a baby. And then in the newborn phase of my little girl's life. And it was a very weird experience. It was extremely challenging to go through 5 months of pregnancy and then a birth and then the newborn phase in the middle of a global pandemic under lockdown, where I had no access to family, or healthcare was completely changed. The healthcare system completely was turned on its head, including kind of the way that births happened, and trying to make sense out of the most transformative spiritual even event of my life in the middle of a pandemic, in the middle of Donald Trump, wreaking havoc on the world. It was just very weird. It was very weird. I for a while, I kind of retreated into a very private space and was just doing kind of the primal work of being a new mother and trying to get my head around the reality of having a little child in the middle of all of this. And of course it was extremely isolating because we weren't seeing anybody. We were just completely isolated from everyone. And so the communal experience of having a new child just wasn't there. So it was a weird experience for me. It's been probably one of the more pivotal years of my life, and really complex on every level.
It's been wild. I was talking with a minister the other day who's in one of the reading groups, and she said her college kids were home, because of the pandemic, and they've been helping like they always helped their mom, or with worship service stuff, but this time it was their technology assistant helping her figure out how to do all that kind of stuff. And after the service a couple of weeks ago, she was talking to her son, and he was like, "Mom, do you ever just want to give up?" And he goes into this whole conversation that being a college kid in America who grew up a part of a progressive mainline context, he's like, no one thinks any of these things when they think of Christianity. And look, if you're white and religious, you're more likely to be racist than if you aren't. He's like, don't you just want to give up? There's so many other ways to do good, beautiful things. What's the deal? And she said, I didn't have an answer for him. And I think his answer could be really different than mine. Like, she's like, because this story and this tradition is all like, I wouldn't know myself outside of it, but like, he still has so much life ahead of him. Like, is it worth it? I was like, that's a real depressing way to end this conversation. But I mean, I got resonated with it, where you're like, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, it raises a whole bunch of questions about the future of church attendance, especially in somewhere here like Scotland, where there's already one of the lowest numbers of church attendance anywhere in the whole of Western Europe. So Scotland already has one of the most secularized, and if that's the categories you're using, right, decline. And especially if you've had like now a year where people have not been attending, like there's a lot of questions about, will they go back? What is lost? What is missing? What does it mean to try to engage in these new ways? But as you said, also, what is it that the Christian tradition, theologically, ritually, spiritually, has to offer right now, other than like, especially if people are already tenuous in that, right? Like, so for you, you or the person you're mentioning, there's a way in which it's the air they breathe, even if that air is a little more clogged than it might have been before. So it doesn't seem feasible. But for a lot of people, it was barely feasible before, or it was something to be ridiculed. The sort of common ridicule that you get in Scotland about religion is very different than the United States. And so I think it raises a lot of questions about the future of the religious communities here in Scotland, not just the Church of Scotland or the Scottish Episcopal Church, but also other religious traditions. Like if you already are on a decline, what does that mean, and how will the church respond, especially if it's not the most nimble community? Anyway, on that really exciting note, we got to end on a better question than that.
All right, then let's see. We got to get a fun. Oh, here's a good one from Reddit. So what's the deal? I don't technically believe in God, but I think I'm going to be a Christian again as long as there's no hell and God doesn't have to kill his kid. Is that allowed?
Welcome to the mainline church.
They're getting told that's not allowed if you're wondering about Reddit. And I was like, that's cool.
No, you're good. You're good. We got plenty of places for you.
Here's one, Josh. Is Christianity really a monotheistic religion?
Oh my gosh, dude. Slide in my DMs and ask me if I'm a Muslim. I get so many people being like, when did you revert to Islam? On my Twitter, because if you say something nice about Islam or you are a scholar of it, you must be a Muslim. And the most popular Muslims are the white convert Muslims that are men. So we men and white people still get a lot of praise. So anyway, I hate, and this became really trendy in the revival of Trinitarianism, the sort of like monotheism versus Trinitarianism. Like, we're Trinitarians, not monotheists, or Christianity's Trinitarian, that kind of nonsense, which you understand where it's coming from. I also understand why Muslims say you guys aren't, or Jews say, I don't understand how you can hold these two things together. I'm a Trinitarian minimalist, so I do think that this is maybe my Schleiermacherness. We want to say that God is really present to and for us in Jesus and in the Spirit. But what that means for the inner life of God, we should be as circumspect as possible about, and still affirm the tradition of the unity and oneness of God that we inherit from Israel. So I'm not a good one to ask. I used to be all about the like Trinitarianism thing in my 20s because it sounded so cool. But then you start thinking about it and you're like, it's hard enough to believe in God. Throw in that God is three persons in one nature, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. How do you square that circle? I mean, I think there's intellectual ways to do it, but I, as I've said to other people, if I'm if I'm any Trinitarian heresy, which I probably am, I'm a modalist because I would want a much stronger influence on divine oneness and monotheism. So Christianity claims to be monotheistic in much of its actual lay practice. It's probably not fully monotheistic, but that's okay, because I think even very strict monotheistic religions, I hate that word, I can't believe I just used it, like Judaism and Islam, also talk about the ways in which God is present to us in multiple ways, right? So Islam has 99 names of God, 7 attributes of God, a recognition that even if God is radically one, God comes to us in ways that are multiple. So the 99 names, or in Judaism, the ways in which there's almost a person-like character of the wisdom of God. So it's a perennial philosophical problem.
Just from a scientific perspective, it's really it's always been really interesting to me that Christianity has managed to maintain its monotheistic street cred for as long as it has, because just cognitively, when you use person language for these different, for God, the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, regardless of how nuanced and careful your theology is around this, your brain does not do that. Like your brain cannot handle the processing of nuanced theology when it hears Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Your brain is going to think of them as distinct entities, distinct beings. It's just the way our brains happen. And it's I don't know. I'm not actually sure if anyone's researched this, the Trinity from a cognitive science of religion and linguistic perspective, the way that human brains and minds process the Trinity in different languages, for example, or when some traditions emphasize the Trinity more than others. It's a really fascinating discussion just scientifically.
I mean, to connect my interest and your interest, it's the same. I mean, Muslims are just yeah, you say you're a monotheist, but look at what you do. Look at how you move your body. Look at how you image it. Look at how you speak, Father, Son, and Spirit. It's not like different names. God is a king. God is merciful. God is the ruler. God is lover, whatever terms. That's a different thing than Father, Son, and Spirit. And I was looking around my office for a track that I have. The first time I went to Al-Azhar, which is the main university, Sunni learning, hundreds and hundreds of years old in Egypt, where I had walked in. This is 2007, maybe, my first visit. And someone comes up to me and English, Spanish, French, German. And I'm like, English. He runs off. And I think he's going to get a track that's Islam's a religion of peace. We're not terrorists. It was that kind of era. And what he came back with was Muslim answers to Christian questions. And I kept it because it's essentially the logical conclusion of lots of Christian positions about the Trinity, about the Eucharist, about Jesus dying on the cross. And it's pretty funny because it's totally accurate, but it's also totally taking Christianity to its extreme, right? So it's what kind of God lets themselves be defecated out of a body? Which, if you follow the logic, if the Eucharist is really Jesus and Jesus is really God, and you eat Jesus, then you're going to have to poop Jesus, and that's not good for God, right? And it's the same thing with the Trinity. So I do think there is a way in which Muslims and Jews have historically said, yes, of course, God has to be spoken of in a multiplicity of ways, because even the one is known to us, accommodated to us in vast varieties of ways, through scripture, through imagination, etc. That's fine. You can be a monotheist and do that. But the difference is you Christians have eternalized this in these 3 people. And why do you stop at 3? Why not 4? What's the thing about threesomes? Why not keep going? So yeah, I mean, I still think it is, but as Sarah was saying, I think the liturgical practice makes it really hard. And anyone who's had kids and or your kids are old enough to speak. Maybe Rowan is such a great 6-month-old. She's already having in-depth theological conversation. But Tripp, you know this. Other readers may know this. If you talk to your kids about the Trinity, or you pray, or they go to church, they ask these questions like, how is Jesus God? How is this there? How do you square a circle, right? Kids know this, which is indicative of what Sarah was saying about just the regular cognitive scientific aspect of Christian worship.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure most of us have had this experience of being a child and trying to pray and not knowing if you're praying when you pray to God, if that's the same thing as when you say, "Dear Jesus," or if you pray for the Holy Spirit to fill you. I remember being young, like really young, and not being clear on who I was directing my prayers to. And it really felt like being a child, it really felt like they were like three different people, and I had to select which one was the right one for the particular ask. So.
Well, you got to be strategic.
Yeah, exactly.
See, I feel like the difficulty really disappeared with the Trinity fidget spinner, because then you pinch the Godhead and then you flick it, and the Father, Son, Spirit things just start spinning, and like that's how you deal with the holy threesome is you pinch the Godhead, and then it all works out.
You should never open the door to Trip Fuller.
You have to admit, like most children's sermons explaining the Trinity don't help. And almost all the examples they give are heresies. So like the egg thing and all that kind of stuff, it's just really,
I know it's impossible.
That's why modalism is the best one.
Because then you can use the water example, right? Like,
yeah, I mean, it's the best of I know that they're all heresies and perichoresis and unity and whatever, blah, blah, blah. I mean, I know all of that. And I've watched that stupid leprechaun video that the arrogant Lutherans did with, St. Patrick and the heresies, right? Like, okay, so it's a confession we make. And this is why, to pimp on Schleiermacher more, he is Trinitarian throughout in terms of God is really present to us in Jesus and in the Spirit. But the conclusion of a Trinity proper being very much at the end and being very like, this is what we have to say, but let's not say so much, I think is as much as he's been bashed by that, I think he's totally right. Like, to begin like Bart does, or like this whole Trinitarian revival, Zazoulis, Lacuna, I think Kathy's book, Lynn Tonstad's book, and Karen Kilby's essays have sort of put that to bed rightly, or it should, but unfortunately social Trinitarianism and kids' sermons keep it going.
So after we thought we were done recording, Josh tells this amazing story of some of his high-quality research on Karl Barth. So we're going to fade back in. A joke about Ravi Zacharias, and then you'll see. This is high quality.
Dude, I mean, let's go to Ravi Zacharias. Like, who didn't know that?
Okay, fine, yes.
Like, if you got, like, this is the problem of Christians. Yeah. Like, this was the least surprising thing ever.
I know. I'm like, are we still? I thought we already knew all of this. Like, why is everyone treating this like some huge revelation? Like, we weren't already very clear that this man was a sexual predator on top of being intellectually dishonest in every way possible.
And it's like the Bartians who are like shocked that they find out that, oh my gosh, Bart essentially was a polygamist. I can't.
And I love that hey, I have strong feelings about all of that, by the way. I'm like, sucks for Nelly, but like.
Dude, I mean, look, I want to try to defend the situation. I'm not because I'm a defender of Bart, but like, look, he tried to get divorced.
Yeah, exactly. People have weird marriage arrangements. Like, why is this hard? Like,
Nellie wants to get divorced at one point beforehand. They never wanted to get married. They got forced to get married.
Exactly, arranged marriage, basically.
And Bart says, like, look, I want to get it with Lottie, and
also she's gonna have my books for me on the DL. So Nellie brought a lot of hurt upon herself. I mean, they could have worked. I mean, yeah.
Well,
do you know what we're even talking about? Exactly. So people need to stop
together.
being worried about it. Exactly.
They all live in the same house.
They went on vacations together. Yeah. It's ridiculous.
They all got buried together. Yes. And I mean, did I tell you this about Bart at Union Seminary? That the Richmond one, not the New York one. So when Bart comes to the States, he isn't supposed to go anywhere in the South. He's supposed to go to Union, to Chicago, and then to San Francisco, Princeton, and then San Francisco. But Richmond thought of itself as the intellectual bastion of the Southern Presbyterians. They had a PhD program. They had Tillich do lectures, blah, 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 blah. So the president's like, I need to get Bart to come down here. We're the big Presbyterians in the South. Invites Bart. Bart says no. He writes back again, finds out that Bart is a huge Civil War buff. Bart was a huge Civil War buff.
Of course he was.
And he says, I'll get you a private tour of the head of the Virginia Historical Society. We'll take you to Manassas. We'll take you all the battlegrounds. Just come and talk to our faculty. You don't have to give a public lecture. Bart hears this, is like, okay, changes his plans, takes the train down to Richmond for like 3 or 4 days. Of course, when he gets there, he gives a public sermon and he gives a public lecture. It's the one where he says Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so as an answer. That's the picture, I don't know if anyone's seen him, of like shooting a Civil War rifle. There's a picture of Bart like on his knees shooting a rifle. That's pretty famous. And in the background is Lottie. Well, they have the recordings and all of the letters in the Union Library. And one day when I was procrastinating from writing my PhD, I asked the librarian, can I look at these? And it's pretty funny because it's like very 1962 Southern. Like, we're not going to say what we're thinking, but we're going to say what we're thinking. And you can tell, like, in the letters written between the faculty, like, who is Lottie? Why do they only need one room? What's going on? Like, but we're not going to say it, but we're all thinking it. Like, why isn't his wife here? And Marcus, his son, is with him. And so clearly, like, his son knows the deal. But it's all this, like, very proper 1960s Southern moderate Presbyterians not wanting to offend. You know, they've scored this huge thing by getting him to come down, but they don't want to challenge him. But they're also like, like, this seems morally dubious. So it's really funny. And you see all these pictures where
the mistress is just there.
So it wasn't like, it
That's
wasn't
funny.
behind closed doors. It wasn't like, this is what shocks me about all the shocked Americans who last year read the article and are like, I can't read Bart ever again.
Yeah. Yeah, that was the edited tame version of that conversation. I know. Got to get them on late at night for a homebrewed happy hour with high quality beverages, and y'all send in questions. I think it's a good idea. Anyway, here's the actual last question. Enjoy.
So one last question was, for someone that's interested in reading Muslim theology and hasn't done it before, what is a good first text?
That's a hard question. Yeah, I mean, so one of the things, Islamic theology is important, but not nearly as important as it is for Christianity. So just like Judaism, theology is not as vital as law, ritual practice, commentaries on the Quran, etc. There's a book by Said that's sort of like intro to Muslim thought that is good. That sort of just gives you a rundown of the major ideas. There's a recent book by Martin Wen on modern Muslim theology, and it's more of a constructive attempt. I've mentioned the 99 Names of God, one of my own favorite and well-known Muslim theologians, intellectuals, Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, who died in 1111. He wrote a short commentary on the 99 Names of God, which talks about some of these issues if you want to read primary source texts. So those are a couple places that you could look at. There's the Cambridge Companion on Classical Islamic Theology gives you a little bit of the rundown, but it also depends what you're into. If you're into the more mystical side with Ibn Arabi, Rumi, etc., or the more scholastic. But there is a really interesting revival of Islamic theology right now called Kalam Jadid, which means the new Kalam. Kalam is the word Arabic for theology. It actually just means word or discourse. And there's a lot of young Muslim scholars, especially in Germany and the UK, who have been trained, who grew up here, and are trying to bridge Western discourse about theology and philosophy on the one hand, and classical Islamic thought on the other. So we've got a new series called Islamic Scripture and Theology with the Edinburgh University Press to do that. And there's a lot of younger scholars that are writing stuff. So if people are keen, I can send you a few of those names if you want to dive a little bit deeper into those debates. And I know from some of the applications I get, there's also an increasing interest in science and religion amongst Islamic studies people as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you both for hanging out on the internet and helping me figure out how the Trinity works and what religious experience is really about. I feel complete.
You must have a really low bar right now, Trip. If that's
It's true. I do have a low bar. Like,
Also, I wish people could see the screen right now. Like what you would see before you is three people who are just completely exhausted by life and pretty much scraping the bottom of the barrel for any ounce of energy we can work up at any particular moment of a day.
I know we ran out of time before we could do y'all's horoscopes. So